Introducing Rabbi Joel Zeff at 10:02 on a Wednesday morning. So we zip along with the Zoom with the Faring Eshkolel. Rabbi Zeff will, I believe, start a new series, unless it's a one-off, on Matan Torah, Torah from Sinai.
Hi, everybody. So everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So first of all, this is actually the second of a series, which we began last time, but there was a 2-week interruption. So we're going to do a review, as we always do in any case. And also, Bruce, did you get a chance to redistribute the sources?
Yes.
Okay, great.
But Arthur always posts it on the chat.
So yeah, good. So everybody should have this source sheet that says Torah Sinai V'Shitat Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, Chelek Aleph, right? The notion of Torah from Sinai and the approach of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, part 1. Now, to do a quick review of what we did last time, we first wanted to lay out this notion of Torah Sinai. The Torah comes from Sinai. Now, that idea is already famously formulated in Pirkei Avot, the passage of the Mishnah, which it doesn't deal with halachic issues, but deals with character development and values. And the Torah there says, or the Mishnah says very explicitly, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. Right? Moshe received Torah from Sinai, and he handed it over to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua to the sages, etc. So the Mishnah seems to say that, right, very plainly, that Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. We also have another Mishnah which starts off on a very positive note, and that is that every Jewish person has a portion in the world to come. By the way, it doesn't say that they have the same portion. So we just heard Rabbi Grunstein and Arthur asking the question about reward. So maybe some people have a 5-star Olam Haba, some people have a 4-star Olam Haba, but that all Israel has a portion in the world to come. That's the good news. Except for then, if you read on in the Mishnah, don't stop learning that Mishnah too soon, because then it goes on to say, and these are the ones who don't have a portion of the world to come. And then it goes on, lists a whole bunch of things for which you apparently lose your place in the world to come. And sometimes in a joking fashion, I like to joke with my students, and if they ask a particularly impudent question, or I like to say they just lost their place in the world to come. But you probably didn't. In any case, one of the things for which you lose your place in the world to come is a person who says, Ve'ein Torah mina shamayim, a person who says the Torah is not from heaven, right? So apparently this is a very central idea, that the Torah was not written by a bunch of guys, right? A committee that got together, or people in different time periods, etc. And as a matter of fact, we then saw the Rambam, who in his discussion of the 13 principles of faith, one of those principles of faith is this idea that the Torah is min hashamayim, that the Torah is a product of revelation, right? This is an absolutely fundamental principle of Jewish faith. And the Rambam makes a very important point. That is, he says, we can't understand the process by which that happened. This is revelation. It's mystical, right? But we understand the product, right? So I want to make that distinction. Process versus product. How exactly the Torah was revealed, that's something we can't understand. It's mystical. It's bridging the gap between the infinite, unknowable God and the very solid, flesh and blood, finite human beings. Bridging that gap is mystical, right? So we can't understand the process, but the product is the Torah. Yes, Bruce.
So the overwhelming majority of Jews today, the non-Orthodox Jews, may not believe that. If that's the case, what do we say about their status? They're Jews, but they're not practicing Judaism, or how do we explain what it is that they're doing?
Yeah. So the first sense that occurred to me, just because I have this inner demon in me that likes to joke, that means there'll be a lot of room in the world to come, because there'll be a lot of vacancies. So, but that's not serious. On a more serious note, according to the notion that you lose your place in the world to come if you think the Torah is not a product of revelation. So under normal circumstances, we would say have to take that at face value. Indeed, there'll be vacancies, except for there's a very famous idea, which I'm sure everybody here has heard, and that is that the Jews of our generation, even the Jews of the past few generations, are in the category of a tinok shenishba, that like a child who was captured among the non-Jews and was raised as an idolater, and they're not held responsible for the way they act and believe, because how could you expect them to? They were raised, by idolaters. So very substantial halachic authorities hold that that's basically the status of everybody nowadays, and you really can't blame them for not observing and not believing in the traditional way. Matter of fact, the Rambam takes that idea one step further. He talks about the Karaites, and he says that even somebody who was born as a Karaite and was indoctrinated as a child into Karaite ideology and practice, which is not normative, obviously. But then later on, they are walking around Jerusalem, and somebody says, "Hey, you want to attend a seminar at Esha Torah on whatever Torah codes or whatever?" I don't even know if they do that anymore. And these seminars are going to absolutely compelling and convince you to believe and act in the normal traditional way, and they still don't believe it, right? They still reject normative Jewish practice and belief. So the Rambam says you might think at that point they're not in the status of a tinok shenishba, like a child captured among the Gentiles and therefore can't be held responsible because they don't know any better. They just attended the Esha Torah Discovery Seminar. So now they should be held responsible for their subversive and non-conforming beliefs and practices. Rambam says, no, they're still a tinok shenishba, like a child raised in captivity, because we tend to have these views that were indoctrinated as a child. It's very hard to let go of them. We're sort of already poisoned, as it were, and we're still not held responsible. So that's the answer to your question there.
I mean, the person does every mitzvah he should. His belief is a little weak. That doesn't push him into the olam haba category. It's the
No.
belief that's fundamental, we're saying.
Yeah, and that's an important idea. And I think I've mentioned this in the past, that the Rambam begins his Mishneh Torah, his law code, with Hilchot Yesodei Torah, the laws of belief. Right? According to the Rambam, belief is just as important as practice. And you take a look at the Ten Commandments, which to be politically correct, I like to call the 10 suggestions. So they don't always deal with behavior. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt is not prescribing a behavior. It's an affirmation of a certain belief. Okay, fine. Now, what we saw then is that, in fact, nothing is simple. Now, I want to just go into this in a little bit more detail. I've had the privilege of being a dayan, a judge on rabbinic courts for conversion. I did that in the United States. I've done that a little bit here. And the dayanim, when it comes to conversion, usually they ask questions about belief, right? As based on what we just said, that's also important, not just practice. And they'll ask a question like, well, where'd the Torah come from? And what they want the candidate for conversion to say is, it was given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. And if they say that, they pass. As a matter of fact, I've been present for these tribunals, we'll call them, in which the judges will say to the prospective convert, how many Torahs are given to Mount Sinai? And what they're looking for is, at first the candidate is like, this must be a trick question because they want me to say the Old Testament and the New Testament or something like that. So that's not the answer they're looking for, obviously. What they want the person to say is, the written Torah and the oral Torah. Okay. But it's not so simple. The truth of the matter is those answers, wow, they may be acceptable in a court of conversion, and as a matter of fact, more than acceptable, that's the answer the judge is looking for, it happens to not be fully true. We saw last time famous Gemara that says that the last 8 psukim of the Torah perhaps were written by Yehoshua. Since they describe the death of Moshe, it's a little bit hard to understand how Moshe would be describing his own death. Right? And it's not so simple to say that God just told him what to write. He was still alive, but God said, write this down. I mean, you could say that. And the Talmud does say, according to another opinion, that he did write it. He wrote it in tears. God told him to write it, and he's describing his death, and he's crying for whatever reason he's crying. Right? So you could say that, but it's not so simple, because the other opinion says maybe Yoshua wrote it for a reason, because if Moshe stood for anything, it's for truth. Right? So it's not so simple that Moshe would write, and Moshe went up there and died. Right? Moshe emet, the Torah told emet. Moshe is truth, and his Torah is truth. So that's why we have an orthodox opinion in the Talmud that Yehoshua wrote those psukim after Moshe died. So at least concerning those last 8 psukim, it's very hard to say Moshe received that at Mount Sinai. That's a lot after Yehoshua lived a lot after Mount Sinai when he wrote those psukim. Furthermore, we saw another passage in the Talmud which says, and everybody seems to agree with this, that it seems that the part of the Torah that Moshe received at Sinai was just up to that moment in history, the revelation of Mount Sinai. There are a lot of events that happened subsequent to Shavuot, right? Subsequent to that experience of revelation of the 10 suggestions, right? So, well, where did those come from? So the commentators explain, seems to be the basis of the Talmud, that after an event would occur, let's say the rebellion of Korach, it happened. And when the dust settled, right, the election was settled, the results came in, the Electoral College voted. At that point, and Korach lost, so at that point, God would say to Moshe, okay, now take a seat. Now I'm going to reveal to you how to record what just happened in the Torah. And this happened throughout the desert experience, really more in the beginning and more at the end. There's like this period of silence in the middle. It's not so important for our discussion. The only thing the Talmud debates is, when did Moshe actually record what God told him to put in the Torah? There's 2 opinions in the Talmud. Everybody agrees that the revelations were sequential. They didn't all happen at Mount Sinai, only up to the point from creation to that moment. But things that happened subsequently were revealed later. When did Moshe record them? 2 opinions. One says he recorded them right away. And so at the end of the 40 years, he had a bunch of pieces of parchment that had the recordings of each revelation. And then he sewed them together, and voila, he had a Sefer Torah. The other opinion says no, he had a very good memory, and he memorized them, all these revelations, during the course of the 40 years. And at the end, he just sat down in one fell swoop and he wrote it all down. So both of these opinions agree that the revelations happened over time, way past the revelation of Mount Sinai, right? Moshe didn't receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. He received Torah, he received instruction, but not the Torah. And by the way, I'll get to you in a second, Bruce. If you look carefully at the language of the Mishnah and Masechet Avot, it says Moshe kibel Torah. Moshe received Torah. It doesn't say HaTorah, the Torah, right? So you could even perhaps understand that it's dealing with that. By the way, some commentators say that it's, in any case, referring to the oral law, not even necessarily the written Torah, in any case. Bruce.
Why not presume that what he received were the 613 do's and don'ts and their permutations only? The stories occurred later as they occurred, and including, when they say from Sinai, that refers to the Sinaitic experience over the entire 40 years. I mean, by definition, it means
Yeah.
You saw
Okay,
your son
fine. So,
identity.
so first of all, what you just, the first part of what you said, and that is that he received the commandments. The Ramban, in his introduction to the Torah, says explicitly that. So, Baruch Shekivanta, you can make a blessing that you were able to anticipate what one of the great sages said, Ramban. He says that what he received physically was from creation, from Breshit, until the instructions for the Mishkan. So, basically up to that point. But he also received all the mitzvot, but not in the form we have them now, right? The mitzvot now are embedded among narrative. So he received, I'm being a little facetious, the most popular bar mitzvah present in Israel, at least, is a copy of Sefer HaMitzvot, right? So, or Sefer HaChinuch, really, actually, sorry, Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch is an enumeration of the mitzvot and explanations of their reasons in each Torah portion, right? Sefer Chinuch. That's like the most popular bar mitzvah present. So, we have 4 sons. We have, you know how many copies of Sefer Chinuch we have? So I actually figured it out eventually. What happens is the following. At a certain point, you don't need to have 4 copies of Sefer Chinuch. So you recycle them as bar mitzvah presents. So there's actually only 1,000 copies of Sefer HaChinuch in circulation, but they just keep on being given to bar mitzvah boys who then give them, the parents then give it to the next bar mitzvah boy, from a different family. So in that vein, Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, until the instructions for building the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and he received a bar mitzvah copy of Sefer HaChinuch. He was actually kind of offended when he saw that it was an inscription that said, to Ben Sion Zeph on the occasion of your bar mitzvah. And God, you couldn't get me something new. It had to be recycled. So indeed, Ramban says, Bruce, what you just said. And then in terms of the narrative material, that was revealed over the course of time. And then there's only question of when it was written down in one fell swoop, according to one opinion, little by little, according to the second opinion. Fine. Now, I want to now move forward. That's where we got to last time. We're going to now enter into very dangerous territory. So, and I am not joking, and I'm not trying to be dramatic. I actually thought a lot about not giving the shiur because I think that the vast majority of Orthodox rabbis would consider it to be heresy. I like to consider myself to be among the vast majority of rabbis. Like, I'm not really one of these pioneering rabbis that likes to be crucified. There are rabbis. Have you noticed it? The rabbis that enjoy being crucified, besides the famous one, right? He wasn't a rabbi. So like some people sort of enjoy being martyrs for some kind of ideological cause. I don't enjoy that. But more than that, this notion of Torah Sinai, of Torah being a product of revelation, really is absolutely fundamental. I happen to be right now teaching a couple for conversion. And we're using a book that I'll bet many of you have at home, To Be a Jew by Rabbi Chaim Donin. It's a very, very popular book. It's sort of like, not really necessarily meant for converts, really meant for anybody. One volume, basically, at least the overview of everything you need to know to be a Jew. Okay. So he makes the following point, and I think it's probably clear. This notion of Torah being the product of revelation is pivotal. Meaning, if you accept this notion, unless you're very neurotic, you're probably not going to be an observant Jew. Now, let me explain. So what I mean by, and I meant that facetiously, unless you're neurotic, there are people who grew up in Orthodox homes who don't necessarily believe in traditional Jewish belief, but that's the way they grew up. They're comfortable with traditional Jewish observance. And Bruce sort of alluded to people like that before. I think there are a lot of people, perhaps in our circles, who are like this, right? They don't necessarily believe in traditional Jewish belief, but they behave that way. So there's even a term for people like that, orthopractice, right? They're Orthodox in practice, but not necessarily in belief. from heaven. Yeah. So the so the problem is that there is a certain, I would say, at least psychological, if not intellectual, disconnect. Why should I feel compelled to observe these mitzvot if, in fact, God didn't really tell me to do them? Right? I would probably be more inclined to pick and choose, and the liberal movements are like this. You know, there's plenty of fine conservative Reformed Jews. Observe some mitzvot, don't observe some mitzvot, right? Change things, right? Because it's not that God told me to do these things, right? The Torah is a product of human genius, even call it, but they're human beings. So things that make sense to me, I'll do. Things that won't make sense to me, I won't do, etc. So the entire edifice of Judaism is largely based upon the assumption that God is really telling me this. This is not only true with practice, it's true with values, right? A value in the Torah, times have changed. Why should I accept this particular value? Not only that, but there's profound spiritual implications of accepting the notion of revelation. That is the following. At least for Jews, having a relationship with God is no simple matter. You see, if you're a Christian, God forbid for you. For a Christian, it's okay. So you can have a picture of God on your wall. You can have God hanging on a necklace, right? The notion of God to them, God became corporeal, right? He manifested himself in human form. If that's the way one conceives of God, it's a lot easier to relate to God. But for us who deny that God takes on any type of material human form, that takes some work to be able to have an authentic relationship with a God who's inconceivable, who's beyond, right? So there is a way to have a relationship with God. If one assumes that though I can't conceive of God in any kind of material way, but at least I know that God shared with me his wisdom and will through the Torah. Through learning Torah, I can have a relationship with God. But if I think that the Torah was written by some guy named Bruce Almighty, right? So then what about my relationship with God? How do I do that? Even if I believe in God, the Torah is not necessarily, according to this view, God sharing with me his will and wisdom. It's some people. So both in terms of fidelity to Jewish practice, to Jewish belief, and to have an authentic spiritual life, a spiritual connection with God, if one doesn't accept the Torah as a product of revelation, all of that is undermined profoundly. So for this reason, I was very hesitant to discuss what we're about to discuss. We're going to take a careful look at the approach of the Ibn Ezra in his commentary in the Torah, which is a profound challenge, seemingly, to the accepted notion of Torah Sinai, Torah from Sinai, or perhaps more loosely termed Torah Mina Shamayim. That's actually a better term, Torah from heaven, right? Not locating at a certain time and place at Sinai, but Torah is a product of revelation, right? Torah Mina Shamayim, Torah from heaven. So we're going to continue. I'm taking the risk. We're going to do it. But if anybody here loses their faith because of this shiur, I'm in big trouble. Okay, so everybody agrees. This is going to be an intellectual exercise, and we're going to realize how complex things are But everybody's going to be the fine, pious Jew next week as they are this week.
Is there a middle ground of agnosticism where someone says they kind of believe, they're just not sure, as
Well,
opposed to no?
okay, so you're raising a very big issue, and that is what's belief. So let me just say two sentences about it, and then we'll leave it at that. It's not like we have a belief button, right? I'm supposed to believe that Torah is a product of revelation, so I'm just going to press this button here on my arm, like this, and whoa, I've downloaded this belief, and I'm totally convinced. It's not the way things work, right? And how can you even be commanded to believe? Okay, so what I believe the Torah asks us to do, not everybody will agree with my next sentence, is to accept it as a working assumption. It's a working assumption. Now, interestingly enough, psychologically, I find that if people accept things as a working assumption, over time, it kind of sinks in and it comes to the level of belief. But at least the first step is, I'm going to make a working assumption. I affirm as a kind of working assumption that this is true, and it'll sink in. The Rambam, by the way, seems to feel that all these things can be proven, and you're required to study the philosophical proofs of these different notions. I think nowadays people aren't so convinced by that approach, but accept it as working assumption. Okay, now, I want to explain just a bit why I'm going to do what I'm going to do, even though I think it's really dangerous. I think it's important not to accept things in their simple formulation. I told you in the beginning of today's discussion that people who are converting, that rabbis ask them, where did the Torah come from? And the answer you're supposed to give is Sinai. Right? And as a matter of fact, our children who are given Orthodox educations, I think that's more or less what they're told. Right? Where does the Torah come from? Sinai. They learn that in school. They learn it from us. Now let's take the following scenario. We take our innocent children, Shavuot, ask them what that is. That's when God gave the Torah to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. Then they go to Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University, whatever, right? And they have a discussion with somebody, and that person says the following: do you believe that the Torah is given to Mount Sinai? I have a little question for you. We'll make it simple. Okay, there's a story in the Torah where Jewish people were thirsty. Miriam, Moshe's sister, had died. The miraculous well disappeared, and they're thirsty. They go to Moshe and they say, "Oi, are we thirsty?" So Moshe Rabbeinu says, "No problem." Goes to God. God says, "See that rock over there? Go speak to the rock." Moshe goes over to the rock. Instead of speaking to it, he hits it. I'm making the story simple. And God says, "You're busted. You're supposed to speak to it. You failed to sanctify me in the eyes of Israel. You're not going to enter the land of Israel." That's the story. Now, that's in the Torah. Now, I have a little question for you, you pious student here at Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University. Moshe received that at Mount Sinai, right? Yeah, of course, Moshe received the Torah at Mount Sinai. I have a simple question for you. That event happened way after Shavuot, way after the revelation of Mount Sinai. Why would Moshe be so stupid if he already knows the story, that when it actually happens, that God says, "Okay, speak to the rock," that Moshe, what happened at that moment? He forgot what he got at Mount Sinai? Why did he hit the rock instead of speaking to it? Or he said, "Well, God said speak to it, and I really will speak to it, but I already read the story a long time ago. It's in the book, and it said in the story that I'm going to hit the rock, so I'm not going to speak to it because that would mess up the story. So I'm going to hit it, or else it would mess up the story." Do you appreciate that question? How could it be that Moshe got the story already and then messed up when the event actually happened? So I'm just giving an example that now what happens to that innocent beneficiary of the Efrat educational system and his wonderful, pious, innocent parents who taught him that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai? He says to himself, wow, that was a good question. I never thought of it. I'm out of here. I'm going to become a Marxist. I'm out of here, right? Like, that's why, even though simplicity is safe and complexity is dangerous, but I think it's important to realize things are complex so that people don't have overly simplistic notions and then run into big trouble when they become adults.
But that's why anyone who learns the Ramban you said, where the Torah is given up to a point and the other mitzvot, that's the simple answer to the simple question.
You're right. But isn't it amazing that Ramban, I will bet money on this, that 80% of adults in Efrat are not familiar with that Ramban. And that if you would ask them where the Torah comes from, they would say it was given to Moses at Mount Sinai.
Well, that's a weakness in the educational system then. I mean,
that's my point. That's why right now we're going to engage in an educational exercise which is complex, because I think it saves lives in a certain way. The only problem is complex. People have a hard time with complexity. Okay, let's dig in. Everybody ready now? So now, if you have your source sheets where it says Torah Misinai ve'Etgar, in my way mine printed is on page 2, and it's source number 7. We're going to take a look at a simple pasuk in the Torah. Vaya'avor Avram ba'aretz, right? God told Avram to leave his home, and he comes to Eretz Israel. Avram passed in the land. He went on a tour with Eged, ad makom Shechem, until the place of Shechem, ad Elon Moreh, until this place called Elon Moreh. The Canaani az ba'aretz, and the Canaanite was then in the land. Now, let's take a look at Rashi. We see Rashi, source number 8. The Canaani az ba'aretz, the Canaanite was then in the land. Haya ha-Canaani holech v'kovesh et Eretz Yisrael, mizaro shel Shem. That the Canaanites were in a process of conquering the land of Israel from the seed of Shem. Right? Remember, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yefet, and one of those was Shem. We're related to Shem, the Jews. That's why we're called Shemites, Semites, right? From the word Shem. Right? Anti-Semitism is someone who's against Shemites, Semites, the descendants of Shem. Fine. Shebechelko shoshem nafla, Rashi continues, that Eretz Yisrael, when the world was divided up among the sons of Noach, Eretz Yisrael was given to the descendants of Shem. That's us. Okay? Keshechilek Noach et the Eretz Levanav, when Noach divided up the whole earth to his children. Shneemar. Now, how do we know this is true? It says in the Torah, Umalki Tzedek Melech Shalem, that Malki Tzedek was the king of Shalem. Now, Malki Tzedek, he was the king of Yerushalayim. Shalem is the name of Yerushalayim back then. And Malki Tzedek is not his real name. You know that this is true of pharaohs and kings in ancient times. And it's also true if you become the Pope. That's a career option for you. You know, you give up your personal name and you become Pope John Paul the Pious or whatever. Right? It's not your birth name. Your birth name was Seymour Epstein. You become Pope John Paul the Pious. Okay? So when it's referring here to a king of Jerusalem named Malki Tzedek, Malki just means king of. Tzedek is a name of Yerushalayim. That's not his name. It means king of Jerusalem. So who was he? So we have a tradition that the king of Yerushalayim, that's none other than Shem, one of the sons of Noah. Okay? So Shem was the king of Yerushalayim. That's the way it's supposed to be. Because when Noah divided up the globe, Eretz Israel, including Yerushalayim, of course, was given to the descendants of Shem. Okay? Lefichach vayomer Hashem el Avraham. Therefore, the very next pasuk, after it says in the Torah that the Canaanite was then in the land, the very next pasuk says, and Hashem said to Avram, L'zaracha tenet ha'aretz hazot. I will give this land to your offspring. What does that mean? Rashi says, Atid ani lahachzira levanecha. I'm going to return the land to your progeny. Shehem mizdarosh Shem, because your progeny are from the descendants of Shem. What's Rashi saying? It's really fascinating. First, we're going to repeat or summarize the scenario that the pasuk is describing, and then we'll focus on what was problematic in the pasuk. According to Rashi's understanding, what happened? Noah gave to Shem this territory. And indeed, we see that Shem was the king of Yerushalayim. But what happened? As the way of the world, these horrible people, the Canaanites, came and they conquered Eretz Israel. They stole Eretz Israel from the rightful owners, who were the Shemites, the descendants of Shem. So Hashem here is saying to Avraham, I'm going to return Eretz Israel to its rightful owners, that is, the descendants of Shem. Because right now, it's illegitimately being held by the Canaanites. That's what Rashi's saying. That's the scenario. Now, what's prompting this whole discussion? Something really fascinating. Let's remember what the pasuk said. The pasuk said, and the Canaanite was then in the land. Now, most important commentaries on the Torah, the medieval commentaries, have commentaries on them. We like to call them super commentaries. Let's take a look at the super commentary on Rashi, on that verse. These super commentaries try to explain what was motivating Rashi to say what he said. So take a look at the super commentary, source number 9. Siftei Chachamim was one of the famous super commentaries. Even a pretty good Chumash used in Shul that doesn't have other commentaries, just as Rashi, as the Chumash, Onkelos Rashi. Sometimes has in the very bottom Siftei Chachamim, which is the super commentary explaining Rashi, or sometimes called Ikar Siftei Chachamim, like an abridgment of the super commentary Rashi. So look at what this commentator says. To Kashela Rashi, the Az Miutu, Rashi had a hard time with the word then. The Canaanite was then in the land. Mashma Dibimei Avraham Hayu Baaretz, because the word then implies that in the time of Avraham they were in the land. Aval achareichem lo hayu baaretz, but afterwards they weren't. When I say, hey, then the Canaanites were in the land, the Torah says, then the Canaanites were in the land. That implies that then they were in the land, but not now. That's what the word then means. Then they were in the land. Now, who's ostensibly writing these words? Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is writing these words. And he's saying, back then, Bnei Yisrael, I'm going to tell you a story about Avram, a long time ago. Back then, the Canaanites were in the land. The only problem is, read on, V'habi me Moshe adayin hayabar. In the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, guess who lived in Eretz Israel? The Canaanites. The Canaanites. So how can Moshe Rabbeinu be saying, Kinderlach, back then, way a long time ago, the Canaanites were in the land? Implying, but not now. So that's why Rashi had to explain, no, that's not what the word then means. Mishum haki hu chach lefaresh da'az v'lo kodem. It doesn't mean then, but not now. It means then, but not beforehand. Then always is coming to exclude. So either means then, but not now, or Rashi wants to suggest it means then and now, but not before. Meaning, just to put it in a simpler language, that Moshe is saying in the Torah that at that time, it was when the Canaanites had conquered the land from the Shemites. But they weren't living in the land before. Only at that time, then, that's when the Canaanites were conquering the land illegitimately. And that's why God said, you see all these illegitimate invaders, the Canaanites here, who then took possession illegitimately of the land. I'm going to give that land to you. I'm going to return it to its rightful owners.
Rabbi
Yeah.
Zeph, the question I have is, if the Canaanites conquered the land that was already designated for Shem and his offsprings, and Shem, if we understand the tradition, Masorah, that he was actually Malchei Tzedek in Yerushalayim, it's hard for me to understand why a conquering nation would allow the king of the prior occupying nation to continue to reside as king.
Yeah, very good question. So we'll see later on that one of the commentators notes it, but it doesn't really explain. It just says that apparently, for whatever reason, that the Canaanites had not been successful in conquering this particular location. That's a very good question. Like I said, the commentators, as you'll see in a second, note it. They just said that they hadn't been able to conquer it yet. By the way, it's interesting that the way Rashi says it, holech v'kovesh, right? They were sort of in the process, and perhaps that's rather than saying the Canaanites had conquered Eretz Israel, he describes it as they're in the process. So maybe that's the reason that Rashi forms it as they were in the middle of the process, not so much that it was a done deal, in order to explain precisely that issue of Melchizedek.
We also have, I'm not sure if it's documentation, but from language or whatever, that the people in Western Mesopotamia were Amorites, Horites, Amorites from the lower Mesopotamian area, that they were not Canaan. There might have been Canaanite kings, we call them that, because it was the land of Canaan. But that's how the land was called. But the people were actually Amorites, which would be Semites.
You're referring to I'm not sure exactly what you're doing right now.
Before Avram even got there, when he meets his friends and he lives among the people.
Okay, so are you trying to support Rashi right now? You're saying, indeed, we have some. Okay, so I'm not. I mean, okay, whatever. Let's put it aside for now, because I'm not really sure exactly what you're doing, but I'm trying to understand Rashi right now. Okay, so just to.
I have a question to ask.
Yeah, sure.
There was no Yerushalayim in those days. You know, much later when Shmuel came, when Samuel and Abigail came, but there was no Yerushalayim in those days.
Yeah. So the assumption here is that there was. It may not have been Yerushalayim in the grand sense that we think of it now, but there was a place. It was called Shalem. And I mean, that's the evidence of the Torah itself. Already in the time of Avraham, it was called Shalem. You know, Yerushalayim has the word Shalem in it. Yerushalem, right? Yerushalem, right? So you see that from the Torah itself. There was a place called Shalem, which is presumably Yerushalayim. And it had like a ruler. It's not a king like maybe we think of it today, like a king, like Putin, right? It's like, right? King meant like whatever, like I'm the king of Male Michael Street, Arba Aleph, first apartment. I'm the king. That's actually probably not true either. But my wife is in charge. But whatever, you get the idea, right? Melech made me much more limited than we usually think of a king. But Yerushalayim apparently was there. Okay. So just to reiterate, the word Az is problematic. The Canaanite was then in the land. Because if we take that at face value, it means that the Canaanite was then in the land, but they're not now. If Moshe Rabbeinu wrote those words, it's not true, because at the time Moshe Rabbeinu, the Canaanite was in the land. That's a very big problem. Rashi solves the problem. He says, true, then means to exclude something else. So it doesn't mean then but not now. It means then but not beforehand, right? The descendants of Shem were in charge, but then the Canaanites came on the scene, but they're still here now. That's how Rashi explains it. Fine. Let's see how the other commentators deal with the word Oz then. So we're going to take a look now at the next source, number 10. And this is the Radak. The Radak. Okay. So he says the following. Az ba'aretz, the Canaanite was then in the land. Lahodia. Maaseh ha'el urtzono le'ovav. Why is the Torah saying then? It's to tell you, excuse me, the deeds of God and his will concerning those whom he loves. How much God loves Avraham. Let's go on, you'll see. Ki Avram haya over ba'aretz. Avram, he came from very far away. He's a stranger, not indigenous, right? Mikneh rav mod, and he's a shepherd, big flocks. He's noticeable when he moves around. V'hayu ro'im b'mir'eh eretz b'chol makom, and he would take his flock wherever they go. His flock would come and graze. Shaya over sham, every place where he'd go, right, move with his big flock. Ubalei mikomot hamir'eh lo hayu omrim lo davar. Now, can you imagine? My name is Bruce. I have a big, huge land holding. I've got cattle. I like steak. I'm a real man. No quiche eating sissy. Real man. Cattle. All of a sudden, some dude who doesn't even have a Canaanite passport is encroaching on my land with this big plot of sheep. What is a normal person going to do? Big Bruce landholder there. Take his shotgun, go out there, and tell this imposter, wetback, illegal alien immigrant, get off my land or else I'm going to make you very holy with a H, or WH, with my shotgun here, right? Amazingly enough, it didn't happen. Right? So, they didn't say anything to him. It's amazing. And it was a miracle. And through this, that God was able to affirm what God had promised to him, and when he blessed him, he said, I'm going to give you this land. So, how does the Radak understand the word then? The Canaanite were then in the land. He's saying the following. It doesn't mean that the Canaanite were then in the land, but not now. It's emphasizing something that is true even today when Moshe is speaking. It's saying the Canaanite were already then in the land, just like they are now. But amazingly enough, they didn't come out with their shotguns and threaten to blow Avram away when he was encroaching on their land with all of his sheep. So that's the way the Radak explains the word then. It doesn't mean then but not now. It means they were then in the land, just like they are now, and yet they didn't bother Avram when he came with his flocks. This was a way of God showing his great kindness and protection to Avram, and the fact that he's going to actualize his promise of being able to give him the land. Beautiful. No problem with the word Oz. The Canaanite were then in the land. Okay? Now, let's take a look at another approach, Shadal. Shmuel David Lutzato. I've actually gotten very interested in his commentary recently, mostly because it's available for free online. By the way, for those of you who don't know this, there's an unbelievable website called Al HaTorah. You write in English, like A-L-H-A Torah. H-A in Torah. Al HaTorah. It's like Mikro Gedolot. It has a lot of things, but among them, Mikro Gedolot, collection of commentaries, huge collection of commentaries, with, in fact, the most up-to-date manuscripts of those commentaries. So a lot of printing errors have crept into these commentaries. They fixed them in this website, so they're very precise. And commentaries are very hard to access, like Shadal. So Shmuel David Luzzatto. What I like about him, by the way, is he was almost modern. He had a kind of academic Jewish education, right? Like university type, like Semitic languages and philology and history and archaeology. But he was coming from a traditional perspective. Then he kind of unifies them all together. Italian, Luzzatto, famous family. Okay, look what he says here. Bakani Asbarts, and the Canaanite were then in the land. The very next verse is God saying to Avram, I'm going to give you this land. Hikdim lahodia, and therefore the very previous verse, which is the one that says the Canaanite were in the land, Hikdim lahodia Yisrael ki gam bimei Avraham haita arts hahi bidei Canaan. We had to have the previous verse to tell us that also in the days of Ram, the Canaanite was then in the land. Okay, so it doesn't mean then but not now. It means even then, they were in the land, as they are now in Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime. Why do I need to hear this? Really interesting, his explanation, different. Shelo yachshavu shulai b'yamim hahem hayta b'yad uma acheret, ra'ah v'chata'a. That we shouldn't think that in those days, the land was in the hands of some other evil, sinful nation. V'shorish ha'uma hahi. And that nation, in fact, was going to be disinherited. V'natan artza leKanaani. And then it was given to the Canaanites. Let me just explain what he's saying here. So you might have thought that, you know what? In Avram's time, the Canaanites weren't there. You know who was there? I'm going to make this up. The Nazis were there. The Nazis were in charge in the time of Avram. Okay? They were so evil that, in fact, God let the Canaanites kick them out. See, because in the time of Moshe, so we know the Canaanites are in Eretz Israel in charge. Maybe they are in fact newcomers who, not like Rashi said, that conquered the sense of shame, but conquered it from the Nazis, this evil nation. Now, why would Hashem allow the Canaanites to drive out the Nazis? Because the Nazis were horrible, terrible people. So God replaced them with the Canaanites, who are even there to this very day in Moshe's time. So you know what you might think? Those Canaanites are there because God put them there to kick out those evil Nazis. So that means the Canaanites are in Eretz Israel by a divine decision and at some level as a result of some virtue, at least relative to the prior Nazis. So if that were true, so Avram would be saying to himself, Oi, how are we going to conquer Eretz Israel? We'd have to take it from the Canaanites, who themselves were there because they were given that divine right, that they kicked out the Nazis by God arranging that to punish the Nazis.
So obviously, he didn't read the first Rashi in Bereshit.
Yeah, okay, hang on a second. Let me just finish this. Ki Yerusha lehem netana Hashem. You would think that God gave it to the Canaanites as a Yerusha. Lekachitim bodiam. That's why before it says that God promised to Avram Eretz Israel, the previous verse says, that when God made that promise that the land would be given to his descendants, the Canaanites were already there, right? It's not that they subsequently conquered the land from the Nazis. No, they were already there. And therefore, God is saying that don't worry about those Canaanites, right? It's not that they're there because of some kind of virtuous quality they have and that enabled them to conquer the land from some evil previous nation. No, the Canaanites were already there when the promise was made. And when God says, I'm going to give it to you, it's don't worry about it. You won't have any problem conquering the Canaanites because they're not there by any result of a divine decision or some kind of virtue on their part.
Meaning
So that's how Shadal hang on a second. Wait a second. Let me just finish. So that's how let me just sort of summarize and then we'll get to your question. So that's how Shadal explains it, that the Torah is emphasizing that the Canaanites were already there at the time of the promise to Avraham, and rather than what one might have thought that the Canaanites, in fact, are going to be given the land as a kind of divine decision to kick out the evil nation that was there before, and then Avram's descendants will have a hard time conquering it because you'd have to conquer the Canaanites who were there by divine right, as it were. Yes, Bruce.
I thought that it was one of the tests of Avram, that to go to the land, despite the fact that the Canaanim were there, and even though God's promising them the land, other people there, and Avram should just on faith, like the rest of Torah, know that God will ultimately give this to either him or his descendants, despite the fact that there are nations there.
Yeah, so actually what you're saying right now is true, but it's actually true according to every opinion, right? No matter how we explain it, because we had Rashi, we had Radak, and Shadal. In any case, whatever the history is,
right,
the fact remains that there's somebody else there. And other than a divine promise, why should I have confidence that I'm going to be able to conquer it? So that requires an act of faith. So what you said is true according to everybody. I just want to summarize that the issue here is that then the Canaanite were in the land, which might have meant then but not now, right? And that would be very problematic. So Moshe's time, the Canaanite was still in the land. That's all dealt with by the traditional commentators, whether Rashi's approach, Radak's approach, Shadal's approach. But I just want to take one more second just to leave you with the bombshell, and then my apologies to Rav Chaim. So I'll just take one more minute. Look at Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says, V'kanani azbarts. Itachen sheretz Canaan tifasak Canaan miyad acher. It's possible that it means, like Rashi says, right? The Canaanite was then, meaning they hadn't been before. The Canaanite themselves had conquered it from somebody else. So then means then, but not before that. Not then and not now, right? That's Rashi. That's Ibn Ezra quotes Rashi. This is some very brief Rashi. But if you want to say it differently, not like Rashi, yesh lo sod, then this verse seems to be communicating a secret. V'maskil yavin v'yidom, and a smart person will understand it and shut up. That's Ibn Ezra. What he means by that, stay tuned for next week.
Can I just go back to one thing you said before about why didn't Moshe read the Torah and not hit the rock because of the punishment? If you look at the pasuk, his punishment simply was he wouldn't lead Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't say that he won't go into Eretz Yisrael, because it uses the word is a hifil, to lead. Tabiu. Lo tabiu. He won't lead. So he wasn't being excluded from Eretz Yisrael. It's saying he won't lead. Now if he's writing this in advance, big deal.
Yeah. Okay.
What happened here was, why was he punished? Not because he hit the rock. He lost his temper with Bnei Yisrael.
Okay. So let's just assume that's true for the sake of the discussion, and we'll do this very quickly. I still find it, whatever he did was seriously wrong. Now, let's not address the punishment, right? whether he can't go in or he can't lead, right? And we could argue about that, but clearly God is upset, right? That's very clear. Your failure to sanctify me, right? The Torah is very.
So even if you say he had this in advance and he read it, he says, okay, I see. He would read this and say, all right, I lost my temper with them because it looks like I know how to get water out of rocks, as opposed to being told by Hashem, hit this rock. And and because Bnei Israel thought that he was the one bringing out water from a rock, that he knows a natural secret, so to speak, as opposed to being a nest from Hashem. And he says, oh, I can avoid that problem, and the fact that he's not going to lead, all right, fine, I'm going to be old at that point.
Yeah, so just, I mean, I don't think it's complex. It's very hard to understand how it could be that Moshe knew the story in advance and yet played along, right? It makes no sense, right? So we'll leave it at that, and we will continue, like I said, with trying to figure out, what did Ibn Ezra just say? So don't do anything wrong or draw any conclusions, at least until next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi Zev.